The biting wind of the Alaskan winter cut through Elias's tattered wool coat, a cruel reminder of his meager existence. He had spent his entire life on the unforgiving coast of the Bering Sea, a man shaped by hardship and solitude. His face, weathered like a piece of driftwood, told a story of countless storms, lean fishing seasons, and the quiet despair that had become his closest companion. The year was 1888, a time when the promise of gold had drawn men north, but for Elias, the only wealth he sought was survival. His luck had been abysmal. His small, rickety boat was barely seaworthy, and the fish seemed to have vanished from his usual spots. Desperation led him to the settlement's auction, a chaotic affair where the remnants of failed dreams were sold for pennies. He stood in the back, a silent observer, watching a small, dilapidated ice hut come up for bid. It was a pathetic sight, a structure of rough-hewn logs, its single window boarded up, a thick layer of snow already burying its foundation. The auctioneer, a corpulent man with a booming voice, tried to sell it with a flourish, but the crowd only jeered. $4! A man shouted, more as a joke than a serious offer. The crowd laughed, but Elias's eyes narrowed. $4 was all he had left in the world. He had no use for a hut, but the land it sat on, a remote stretch of coastline far from the prying eyes of the settlement, was perfect for setting up new traps. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but he saw a flicker of hope in its isolation. $4, Elias muttered, his voice barely audible above the noise. The auctioneer looked at him, surprised. The crowd fell silent. It was an offer no one expected. Sold! To the Fisherman for $4. Elias handed over his last coins, the weight of the loss sinking in with each one. He was now the owner of a hut he didn't need, on land he couldn't afford to develop. The journey to the hut was a grueling trek. He walked for hours, the snow deepening with every step, the sky turning a deep, bruised purple. As he approached the hut, a wisp of smoke caught his eye, curling from a makeshift chimney. It was impossible. No one was supposed to be there. With a sense of dread and a newfound spark of curiosity, he pushed open the creaking wooden door. Inside, a fire crackled in a stone hearth, and the warm scent of simmering meat filled the air. A woman, her back to him, stood stirring a pot. Around her feet, 3 wolf cubs lay curled up fast asleep, their mother nowhere in sight. The woman turned, and her eyes, filled with a mix of fear and defiance, met his. He had found not just a hut, but a mystery wrapped in the unforgiving embrace of the Alaskan winter. If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to the channel to catch all the chapters of this thrilling tale. Your support helps us create more content like this. The silence in the hut was as thick and cold as the winter air outside. Elias, a man of few words, simply stared at the woman. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, her face smudged with soot, but her eyes holding a sharp, intelligent light. She clutched a wooden spoon, a simple tool that suddenly seemed like a weapon. The wolf cubs, sensing the tension, stirred in their sleep, but didn't wake. Elias finally broke the silence, his voice a low rumble. "This is my hut now. I bought it." Her shoulders slumped slightly, the defiance in her eyes giving way to a weary sadness. "I know. They told me it would be auctioned. I had nowhere else to go. My husband, he died in a hunting accident last month. The settlement, they didn't want me. Not with these." She gestured to the sleeping cubs. "Their mother was killed by a trapper. I found them starving." She paused, her voice barely a whisper. "I couldn't just leave them." Elias looked at the cubs, their small bodies twitching in their sleep. He thought of his own solitary existence, a life of endless labor with no one to share it with. He was an orphan, raised by the sea, and he understood the brutal finality of loss. He looked back at the woman, seeing not an interloper, but a mirror of his own loneliness. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone softer now. "Ilara," she replied, her voice gaining a touch of its former strength. "Ilara Hatcher." Elias said nothing more. He simply walked to a corner of the small hut, took out his small bedroll and unrolled it. He sat down, his back against the cold logs, and watched her. Ilara, seeing that he wasn't going to throw her out, continued to stir the pot, her hands moving with a quiet efficiency. The unspoken agreement was made. For tonight they would share the space. The hut, once a symbol of his last hope, was now a shared sanctuary, a fragile bubble of warmth and life against the relentless, unforgiving Alaskan winter. Elias ate a bowl of the meat stew she offered, the simple meal feeling more nourishing than anything he had tasted in years. He knew this was a strange arrangement, but as the fire crackled and the wolf cubs whimpered in their sleep, he felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't completely alone. Days turned into a week, and then another. The strange cohabitation between Elias and Ilara settled into a quiet, almost domestic rhythm. He would leave at dawn, his traps and fishing lines his only companions, and return at dusk to the smell of a warm meal and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the wolf cubs. He learned that Ilara was a skilled herbalist, her knowledge of the land far surpassing his own. She would spend her days foraging for dried berries and roots, supplementing their meager diet. The cubs, whom she had named Boreas, Luna, and Kale, were growing fast, their eyes now a piercing shade of gold. She trained them with a gentle but firm hand, a stark contrast to the trappers and hunters of the settlement who saw wolves only as a threat. The settlement was a different world, a place of rumors and whispers. Elias's trips there to sell his catch became a source of tension. Men would eye him with suspicion, their questions thinly veiled. "Heard you bought that old hut for a song, Elias?" One trapper, a burly man named Silas, sneered at him. "Heard there was a reason no one wanted it. Something about a woman and her husband's ghost." The rumors had begun, twisting the truth into something sinister. Elias, a man who loathed confrontation, would simply sell his fish and leave, his silence only fueling their suspicions. One evening he returned to the hut to find Ilara looking worried. "A man from the settlement came by today," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He was asking about me, about the wolves. He said they were a danger." Elias's jaw tightened. "Silas," he said, his voice a low growl. "He's a trapper. They hate wolves." "He said he saw tracks," she continued, her eyes pleading with him. "He's going to come back. He said he would take care of the problem." The words hung in the air, a cold threat that settled over the small hut. Elias looked at the wolf cubs, now playfully nipping at each other, and at Ilara, her face etched with fear. He had been a solitary man his whole life, avoiding conflict, but now he felt a new, unfamiliar emotion stirring within him, a fierce need to protect. This wasn't just a woman and her wolves. This was his home, and they were his responsibility. He knew that the quiet, peaceful life they had built was now in danger, and he would have to face the conflict he had spent a lifetime avoiding. The threat from Silas loomed over them like a dark storm cloud. Elias, a man who had always sought to be invisible, now found himself thrust into the role of a protector. He spent his days not just fishing, but scouting the perimeter of their land, looking for signs of intrusion. He taught Ilara how to set simple snares for rabbits and other small game, not for profit, but for their own survival. The wolf cubs, now more like small dogs than wild animals, followed him on his rounds, their playful yips a stark contrast to the danger they represented in the eyes of the settlement. Ilara's bond with them was profound, a connection born of mutual survival and unspoken love. One afternoon, a bitter wind whipped snow into a blinding curtain. Elias returned to the hut to find Silas standing outside, his face red from the cold and a sneer on his lips. He held a rifle loosely in his hands. "Heard you got yourself some pets, Elias," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Wolves of all things. That's a bounty on 4 legs and a danger to the settlement's livestock." "They're just cubs," Ilara said, stepping out of the hut, her voice surprisingly steady. "They don't bother anyone." "They will," Silas spat. "It's in their nature. They're a menace." He raised his rifle, aiming it at the hut's door. "I'm doing the community a favor. This is your only warning, Elias. Get rid of them, or I will, and you won't like how I do it." Elias felt a cold fury rise in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. He stepped in front of Ilara, his back to her, his stance defiant. "Get off my land, Silas," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "They're not a menace. You are." Silas stared at him for a long moment, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He hadn't expected the quiet fisherman to stand up to him. He lowered his rifle slightly, a cruel smile on his face. "Fine, but I'll be back, and next time I won't be so polite." He turned and stomped off into the swirling snow, his heavy boots leaving deep imprints. Elias watched him go, his heart pounding. The confrontation had been a victory of sorts, but he knew it was only the beginning. The fragile peace was broken, and a new, more dangerous chapter of their lives had just begun. If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to the channel to catch all the chapters of this thrilling tale. Your support helps us create more content like this. Following Silas's threat, the hut became more than a sanctuary. It became a fortress. Elias and Ilara worked together, fortifying their small home against the encroaching danger. Elias, with his fisherman's knowledge of knots and ropes, reinforced the door and shutters. Ilara, with her deep understanding of the forest, set up makeshift alarms, strings of dried leaves and sticks that would rustle and snap if someone approached. The wolf cubs, now growing into adolescent wolves, had become their early warning system, their keen senses picking up on sounds and scents long before Elias or Ilara could. They were no longer just pets. They were part of the family, and their survival was intertwined with their own. One cold afternoon, while Elias was checking his traps, he stumbled upon a makeshift camp. A small fire was burning low, and a grizzled old prospector, his face a map of wrinkles and his clothes stained with grime, sat huddled next to it. He was a man Elias had seen in the settlement, a quiet, solitary figure. "You're the fisherman, Elias, aren't you?" the prospector asked, his voice a gravelly whisper. "I'm Jeremiah." Elias nodded cautiously. "I saw that Silas fellow," Jeremiah continued, poking the fire with a stick. "Saw him on your land, snooping around. He's bad news. Always has been. He's got a reputation for being cruel. Kills animals just for the sport of it, not for the bounty." He looked at Elias, a knowing look in his eyes. "I heard about the woman and the wolves. Most of the men in the settlement, they're afraid of what they don't understand, but not all of us. There are some of us who believe in a different way." Jeremiah's words were a revelation to Elias. He had assumed the entire settlement was against them. He had seen only hostility and suspicion. But here was a man, a fellow outcast, offering a hand of solidarity. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. "He threatened us," Elias admitted, the words feeling heavy on his tongue. "He'll be back," Jeremiah said, his voice solemn, "but he'll be expecting you to be alone. He won't be expecting all of us." He didn't elaborate further, but the message was clear. Elias returned to the hut that evening, a newfound hope in his heart. The fight wasn't just his and Ilara's anymore. They had allies in the shadows, people who saw the value in compassion and coexistence, not just in brute force and greed. The isolated hut was no longer alone. It was part of a silent, resilient community. Winter deepened its grip on the land. The days grew shorter, the nights longer and colder. The confrontation with Silas and the discovery of their unseen allies had brought a strange mix of fear and resolve. Elias and Ilara's bond had deepened. They spoke more freely now, sharing stories of their past lives. Elias learned of Ilara's husband, a kind trapper who had taught her about the land. Ilara learned of Elias's lonely childhood, raised by a gruff sea captain who had taught him to fish and to fend for himself. The hut, once a cold and empty place, was now filled with the warmth of shared history and mutual trust. One night, the wind howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the shutters and sending snow piling against the door. Ilara was tending to the fire when the wolf cubs, now almost fully grown, suddenly rose to their feet, their ears perked. They let out a series of low growls, their eyes fixed on the door. "Someone's out there," Ilara whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. Elias grabbed the old hunting rifle he had kept hidden under his bedroll, a relic he had inherited from the sea captain, but had never used. He knew he was a fisherman, not a fighter, but tonight he would have to be. He extinguished the lantern, plunging the hut into a dim, firelit gloom. A few moments later, they heard it, the crunch of heavy boots on packed snow, followed by a loud, insistent pound on the door. "Elias, I know you're in there. I've come for what's mine." It was Silas's voice, thick with liquor and rage. Ilara backed away from the door, her face pale. The wolves, sensing her fear, moved closer to her, their bodies a protective shield. "He's not alone," she whispered, her eyes wide. "I can hear others." Elias listened, his heart pounding in his chest. She was right. He could hear the muffled voices of other men, the scuffle of feet, and the glint of steel against the firelight that shone through the cracks in the door. He had known this moment was coming, but the reality of it was more terrifying than he had ever imagined. He was just one man against a mob. He had no choice but to fight for the home they had built, for the small, fragile family he had found in the most unexpected of places. The long, cold night had just begun, and the fate of the hut and its inhabitants would be decided before morning. The pounding on the door intensified, the wood groaning under the force. Elias knew they couldn't hold them off forever. He looked at Ilara, her face a mask of terror, and at the wolves, their growls low and menacing. "I'll draw their attention away," he said, his voice a strained whisper. "You and the wolves, you get out the back window and hide in the woods. You know the land better than any of them." "No, I'm not leaving you," she pleaded, but he was already moving. Elias positioned himself by the door, the rifle in his hands feeling impossibly heavy. He knew this was a desperate gamble. He unlatched the door, the old wood creaking open. The cold air rushed in, and with it the sight of Silas, his face twisted with a cruel mix of triumph and malice, and two other men, their faces hidden by the shadows. "Look what we have here," Silas sneered, raising his own rifle. "A hero, the brave fisherman." "Leave us alone, Silas," Elias said, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his gut. "Can't do that," Silas said, stepping forward. "Those wolves are a danger, and you're harboring them. We're doing what's right." Just as Silas was about to make a move, a loud, piercing howl echoed through the woods behind them. Then another, and soon the night was filled with the mournful, chilling sounds of a wolf pack. Silas and his men froze, their faces turning pale. They had expected to find a lone man and a woman with a few cubs. They had not expected a full pack. Ilara, at Elias's signal, had let out a series of sharp whistles. The cubs, now fully grown, had responded with a primal call, and the wild wolves of the forest, hearing their own kind, had answered. Silas, a man who saw wolves as nothing more than a threat, was now facing a real and very present danger. The men with him began to shift nervously, their bravado melting away in the face of the unseen pack. "It's a trick," Silas muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. He knew the sounds were real. The wolves were out there in the darkness watching them. Elias held his ground, his eyes fixed on Silas. "This is your last chance," he said, his voice now a firm command. "Leave now. or face the consequences. Silas and his men looked at each other, their resolve broken. The fear of the unseen predators outweighed their greed and malice. With a final, furious snarl, Silas turned and motioned for his men to retreat. They disappeared into the darkness, leaving Elias standing alone in the biting cold. The battle was over, and for now, they had won. If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to the channel to catch all the chapters of this thrilling tale. Your support helps us create more content like this. The immediate danger had passed, but the air in the hut was still thick with the residue of fear and adrenaline. Ilara, her face streaked with tears, rushed to Elias, wrapping her arms around him. The wolf cubs, now more like guardians than pets, circled them, their tails wagging gently. "You were so brave," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Elias, still trembling from the confrontation, simply held her tight. He had never been a brave man. He had been a solitary one, a survivor, but tonight he had fought for something more than just his own life. He had fought for a home, for a family. In the days that followed, the settlement remained quiet. The story of Silas's retreat spread like wildfire, its details embellished with each telling. The fisherman who stood up to the trapper, the woman who commanded wolves. The rumors had once been their greatest enemy, but now they were their greatest protection. The fear of the unknown, of a wild wolf pack and a woman who seemed to command them, was enough to keep the others away. Their peaceful life slowly returned, but it was different now. They were no longer just two people sharing a hut. They were partners, equals, bound by a shared experience of courage and survival. They spent their days together, fishing, hunting, and foraging. Ilara taught Elias the names of the plants and the signs of a coming storm. He taught her how to mend nets and to read the currents of the sea. The wolf cubs, now nearly a year old, were a constant presence, their silent movements a testament to their loyalty. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Elias looked at Ilara, the flickering light casting a warm glow on her face. "Jeremiah, the prospector," he said, his voice soft. "He was the one who told me there were others. He said some people understood." "He came by a few times," Ilara admitted. "He left us some supplies. He said he would let people know we were not a threat, that we were just trying to survive." Elias realized that their victory hadn't just been a result of his courage, but of the small, quiet acts of kindness from others. The network of outcasts and misfits who saw the world differently had been their unseen army. They had won not with violence, but with a community of compassion forged in the unforgiving heart of the Alaskan wilderness. Spring finally arrived, bringing with it a sense of renewal. The snow melted, revealing the dark, rich earth underneath. The ice on the sea began to break apart, and the days grew longer, filled with a soft, golden light. The wolves, now fully grown and confident, began to spend more time in the wild, returning to the hut only to check in on Ilara and Elias. They were a bridge between the human world and the untamed wilderness, a living testament to the possibility of coexistence. The settlement, having heard the full story of Silas's humiliation and the mysterious wolf pack, had largely left them alone. There was still an air of suspicion, but it was now laced with a reluctant respect. Elias and Ilara, once outcasts, were now seen as something more. They were the ones who had faced the wilderness and found a way to live in it, not against it. One day, a small boat, much like Elias's own, pulled up to their shore. A man and a woman, their faces kind and their clothes clean, stepped out. It was Jeremiah, the old prospector, and another woman, a healer from the settlement. "Heard you two might need a hand," Jeremiah said, a warm smile on his face. "The men in the settlement, they're not all bad. Some of us, we want to help. We want to build a better life, not just for ourselves, but for everyone." The healer woman, named Sarah, carried a satchel filled with medical supplies. "I heard Ilara was a gifted herbalist," she said, her voice gentle. "I was hoping we could share knowledge, our ways, your ways. Imagine what we could do together." Elias and Ilara, for the first time since they had met, felt a sense of belonging. The solitary lives they had once known were over. They were no longer just survivors. They were pioneers, building a new community, one based not on fear and greed, but on mutual respect and shared compassion. The ice hut, once a symbol of desperation, was now a beacon of hope, a starting point for a new chapter in the history of the Alaskan wilderness. Years passed. The hut, once a humble shelter, had been expanded into a small, sturdy cabin. The land around it was now a thriving homestead, with a small garden, a few chickens, and a new, larger boat that Elias had built with Jeremiah's help. The wolf cubs had long since left, returning only occasionally to visit, their bodies now larger, their eyes filled with a primal wisdom. Ilara and Elias were no longer just cohabitants. They were husband and wife, their love a quiet, resilient flame. The settlement had changed as well. With the influence of people like Jeremiah and Sarah, a new spirit of cooperation had taken hold. The trappers were no longer a menace, but partners, working to manage the land responsibly. The animosity had been replaced by a grudging and then genuine respect. The story of the fisherman and the widow who cooked for wolves had become a local legend, a tale told around campfires to remind people of the importance of kindness and the strength found in unlikely alliances. On a late summer evening, as the Alaskan sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Elias and Ilara sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the world they had helped create. They were older now, their faces etched with the lines of a life well lived. He held her hand, its warmth a constant comfort. "Remember when I bought this place for $4? He said, a soft smile on his face. "I remember," she replied, her eyes twinkling, "and I remember thinking you were just a lonely old man. And I remember thinking you were just a ghost story," he chuckled. "We were both wrong, weren't we?" She leaned her head on his shoulder, a silent tear rolling down her cheek. It was a tear of gratitude, of happiness, of a life that had turned out to be so much more than they had ever dared to dream. Their story wasn't about magic or miracles. It was a simple human story of two people, alone and forgotten, who had found each other in the harsh, unforgiving wilderness, and in doing so had found a home, a family, and a life worth living. As the last rays of light faded from the sky, they sat in comfortable silence, their hearts full, their story complete. If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to the channel to catch all the chapters of this thrilling tale. Your support helps us create more content like this.